Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 46. The Fall of the House of Cromwell. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome a new member of the Patreon Other House, Keay of the Marquisate of Wolverhampton. If you'd like to join their ranks and listen to the podcast ad-free and help support the show, then go to patreon.com/PaxBritannica. Thank you to all my patrons. I know I've said this a lot recently, but this podcast really wouldn't exist without you. Last time, we saw Oliver Cromwell refuse to become king. Supporters of a return to monarchy argued that it would bring stability to the Commonwealth, it would solidify the gains of the Revolution, and it would forever shut out the hated Stuarts. But Cromwell refused. God had thrown the crown into the dust. Cromwell had been instrumental in that, and he would not build Jericho again. He was reinvested as Lord Protector under the new constitution, the Humble Petition and Advice, which brought back a second chamber of Parliament and restricted the Protector's powers. We saw Oliver Cromwell die on the 3rd of September, the same day as his greatest victories at Dunbar and Worcester. As per the Humble Petition and Advice, he is said to have nominated his eldest son, Richard, to be his successor. When Richard Cromwell was proclaimed Lord Protector, he was far from the only candidate. Just within the Cromwell family, his younger brother Henry is often held up as a viable successor to their father. Henry had been on the national stage for longer. He had far more experience in government and had been running things in Ireland for years. He was politically astute and well-liked. But if Henry wanted the top job, and that's unclear, then he was a victim of circumstance. Neither of the two factions at court, the military or the civilian, wanted him to succeed Oliver. The military did not trust him. He had removed their control over the Irish government, and despite his own liberal religious belief, he was seen as too close to Presbyterians. Lord Protector Henry Cromwell might reduce the influence of the military from the rest of the Commonwealth too. The civilian faction might have been more tempted by Henry. Lord Broghill had worked extensively with the younger man, and knew that he was capable. But the civilian faction had been pushing hard for a hereditary succession. That Oliver had seemingly nominated his eldest son had been a blessing for that cause, and they could not simply skip over Richard because his younger brother was a better choice. After all, if you favour hereditary succession, then you don't get to choose. The other possible candidates were military. Charles Fleetwood, Richard and Henry's brother-in-law, and John Lambert. When I say possible, I mean in the sense that historians consider them as possibilities, and they make for interesting counterfactuals. To the Council of State, it was no longer their job to decide on Oliver Cromwell's successor. If the dying protector had nominated Richard, that was that. If he hadn't, and this was a fudged solution, there was no space for discussing alternatives. Now, if Cromwell had nominated someone else, that's also an interesting counterfactual. But Richard Cromwell is now Lord Protector. Will he have a long and happy reign? Or, perhaps as the title of today's episode gives away, will he not? Let's start with a summary by friend of the show, Paul Lay. Quote, Richard Cromwell was the worst prepared adult head of state in British history. End quote. He had no experience of government. He'd never been an MP or played any role in local government. He'd also never served in the army or made the sort of connections which the new head of state of a government, founded almost entirely on military support, might need. He had two things in his favour. The first was his surname. He was a Cromwell. Despite his father's stated desire to avoid a new dynasty, the Cromwell name still meant something. Addresses of loyalty flowed into Whitehall, from the City of London, from the army, from the shires, and from Scotland and Ireland. Scotland was still in the capable hands of George Monk, Ireland was, of course, ruled by his brother Henry. The second was actually a silver lining to his relative anonymity. No one really knew what he stood for, which meant, at least at first, he could stand for anything. Everyone hoped to get the new Lord Protector on their side. It was a pretty successful transition of power, considering the unprecedented nature. We have many accounts of how peaceful London was in the wake of Oliver's death. Even John Thurlow, who we can safely assume knew what he was talking about, reported to Henry that everything was calm. Quote, "It hath pleased God hitherto to give his Highness your brother a very easy and peaceable entrance upon his government. There is not a dog that wags his tongue, so great a calm are we in." End quote. Richard received all the ceremonials. The Lord Mayor presented him with the sword of the City of London. Richard took the investiture oath drafted for the humble petition and advice. He didn't undergo a ceremony as his father had done, perhaps because there was no parliament to recognise him, but he was proclaimed Lord Protector in every market square, and this was often met with cheers, feasting, and partying. Church bells rang throughout the Commonwealth, and Richard soon received the condolences and the congratulations of the crowned heads of Europe. Royalists in the Commonwealth and in exile despaired. This wasn't how it was meant to go. It looked like a new dynasty was putting down roots, whatever the label it chose to use. Why had the succession been unchallenged? When would there be the opportunity for a return of the Stuarts? Where was the chaos they had expected? This honeymoon period lasted, all of 2 weeks. The army grandees congregated around Charles Fleetwood, who was personally loyal to the Protector. However, the junior officers stationed in London gathered at St. James's Palace, which had been turned into a barracks. Here, the godly officers regularly met for prayer and Bible study. These prayer meetings naturally offered the chance to have a good chinwag about how things were going. The more numerous junior officers were far less personally tied to the new Protector. Oliver had been one of them, a soldier first and foremost. But this new guy, who has the job because he was Cromwell's son? What business did he have telling the army what to do? How could they trust him to have the army's interests in mind, especially when he was surrounded by so many hated advisors, the civilian faction? There were 3 specific concerns which the army had with their new Lord Protector. The first was freedom of conscience. They didn't know much about Richard, but they knew that he was much less in favour of toleration than his father had been. Second was his lack of military experience. How could he know of the soldiers' lot? Could he be trusted with their lives, and would he say no to a crown if the kingly faction offered him one? And thirdly, money. The soldiers' wages were in arrears, and they wanted to be paid. Richard had inherited a national debt of more than £2 million, in addition to what was owed to the army, and who could say whether he would prioritise the soldiers? On the 18th of September, an address from the army was presented to the Lord Protector. On the face of it, there was nothing dangerous in this address. Signed by 276 officers, it informed Richard that the army was fully obedient to the government of the Lord Protector and his Privy Council to ensure that army interests were not overlooked. But Ian Gentles describes the address as carrying a menacing undertone. By implication, if the new Lord Protector didn't safeguard the army's interests, well, who can say? Richard thanked them for their address, confessed that he did not have the experience of his father, but he would nevertheless protect their interests. It was the will of Providence that he was now Lord Protector, after all. He appeared to have deflected the implied threat. But far from it. Early in October, the junior officers presented Fleetwood with a petition, signed by 300 of their number, demanding that he, not Richard Cromwell, be their commander-in-chief. Fleetwood rather sheepishly presented this to Richard, who rejected it out of hand. Fleetwood returned to his officers and gave them a right telling off. They were threatening army unity at precisely the time they needed to have one voice. Richard gave a speech to them later in October, grounding his rejection in the Constitution. The humble petition and advice had granted him these powers, and he could not, would not, give them up. Together with the army grandees, the Lord Protector kept a lid on army dissent, for now. The new year of 1659 brought with it a new Parliament, and under the humble petition and advice, the Privy Council had no power to prevent anyone from taking their seats. This saw the return of many old Commonwealth's men, Republicans like Sir Arthur Haselrig and Henry Vane chief amongst them. It also saw the election of one John Lambert, who was no longer an army officer. Over 500 MPs were elected and took their seats on the 27th of January. This was a lot of MPs with many different points of view, so it would be a difficult parliament to manage in perfect circumstances, and this was certainly not perfect circumstances. Richard called this parliament for two main reasons. The first was, of course, money. Almost £1 million were owed in wages to the army alone, and the state was also millions in debt already. He needed Parliament to vote taxation. The second main reason was more symbolic, but no less important. Parliament should formally recognise Richard's succession as Lord Protector. Thurlow introduced a bill to do just that. By passing an act of recognition, Richard's legitimacy would be secured. This should have been a formality. The MPs had had to swear an oath before taking their seats, so surely this was the work of an afternoon. Instead, it was only on the 14th of February that the motion passed, and with only 2/3 of a vote. MPs had used the opportunity to debate almost every aspect of the Constitution and the wording of the Act. Thurlow's Act had stated Richard became Lord Protector with the death of his father. Did this suggest hereditary succession? If Oliver had not nominated Richard before he died, unlike the official story suggested, then maybe this was Providence telling the Commonwealth they didn't need a protector. Should MPs instead consider a new settlement, either restricting the powers of the Protector or even returning to a republic? And though the Act of Recognition passed, it tabled the difficult questions, like whether the Lord Protector should have control over the army for a future date. This act should have reinforced the new administration, but instead it destabilised it before it even got going. But the act still passed, and through the rest of February and into March, it appeared that the Parliament was cooperating with the government. Critics, both in the army and the Commonwealth's men, were good speakers, but they were outnumbered. When another petition emerged from the army in mid-February seeking to protect liberty of conscience from the more conservative Parliament, the Lord Protector was able to smother it by personally rebuking the officers. But the calm surface hid growing discontent, fueled particularly by a dangerous alliance between elements of the army and Commonwealthsmen MPs. Gentles has identified 3 factions within the army ranks: the grandees and senior officers, who centred around Fleetwood and who wanted to secure the army's power; the junior officers, who were more fervently republican and godly; and a third faction who backed the Lord Protector. Of the 3, the protectoral faction was the smallest, and the junior officers could rely on the support of individual grandees. It was a dangerous brew. Amongst the Commonwealth's men, the leading lights were, of course, Henry Vane and Arthur Haselrig. Vane had been active since the new Parliament had been called, and a tidal wave of pamphlets flowed off friendly presses. They called for the return of the good old cause, a return to the Republic, or at least a severe scaling back of the Protector's powers. A new constitution should be drafted by godly men, and MPs from amongst the most pious and wise men. Vane's ideal was for these men to lead the Commonwealth into a godly nation, not by force, but by example. In April, yet another petition was presented to Richard. Fleetwood once again brought it to his brother-in-law, and once again it called for the Protector to secure the army's interests. They wanted Richard to protect religious toleration They wanted Fleetwood to be their commander-in-chief, and they wanted to be paid. They justified their demands by referring to the good old cause, what they, or at least the older soldiers, had fought for in all three kingdoms. Richard accepted this petition, outwardly gracious but inwardly seething. He had inherited his father's rage, and this repeated attack on the office of Protector angered him. But he had it read aloud in Parliament. At first the MPs ignored it, which sent the suspicions of the army skyrocketing, but finally Parliament began debating how best to pay the army. Now, if you're thinking that, finally, we're going to see a Parliament which just paid their soldiers and didn't antagonise the men with guns, well, think again. On the 14th of April, the General Council of the Army met, and more than 500 officers attended. This meeting drew up a document confirming that the execution of Charles I had been lawful and urging Parliament and the Lord Protector to stand against the House of Stuart and a return to monarchy. The House received this declaration and panicked. Learning absolutely nothing from earlier battles between Parliament and the army, they voted to forbid the General Council of the Army from meeting without the Lord Protector and both Houses of Parliament giving permission. They also forbade the army from sending petitions to Parliament or to the Lord Protector. Worse, Richard then gave his assent to this. Even worse than that, Parliament began discussing how to reduce the size of the army, and worse even than that, placing it under the control not of General Fleetwood, not even of the Lord Protector, but of Parliament, civilian control over the military. This went too far. Fleetwood felt personally betrayed by his brother-in-law, who had promised him that he wouldn't let this happen. Desborough already disliked Richard, and so when the Lord Protector arrived at a meeting of the officers and ordered them to go back to their regiments and stay out of politics, he was more than happy to tell him where to stick it. Now Parliament voted to confirm Richard's control over the military, but it was too late. Parliament could vote on whatever they wanted. The army was not listening. On the night of the 21st of April, 1659, Charles Fleetwood mustered all the regiments in London to meet at St. James's Palace. Soon, thousands of infantry and cavalry were gathered, and at midnight Fleetwood gave the order to march on Whitehall. The army paraded through the winding London streets, converging on the centre of government. There was no beating of drums, they were not going to war, but they chanted, "For the good old cause, no kings, a commonwealth, a republic." The army reached Whitehall Palace, where Richard was, of course, wide awake. He was the Lord Protector of England, Ireland and Scotland, Commander-in-Chief of one of the most effective fighting forces in Europe, but he watched from a window as that army surrounded him. Even his own lifeguard defected. Aside from a few loyal officers like William Gough and Edward Whaley, who could not get their men to stand with them, the army was now his enemy. But they had not come to take his head, or even his position. When Fleetwood and Desborough met with their Lord Protector, they assured him that the Protectorate would survive, but Parliament had to go. With no choice, Richard gave the order. As dawn broke and MPs arrived at St. Stephen's Chapel, they found red-coated soldiers guarding the locked doors. The Third Protectorate Parliament was dissolved. There wouldn't be a fourth. Because though the army grandees said they didn't want to destroy the Protectorate, and they were probably sincere, they did not speak for the whole army. A council of officers was set up in Fleetwood's house, and this now took over governing the country. In another echo of previous events, Parliament had been dissolved by an army which hadn't planned for what came after. So naturally, they did the sensible thing and recalled John Lambert. He was one of the few among their number with a good head for politics, and he'd been here before. He'd originally established the Protectorate. But this wasn't held against him now. He'd fallen out with the Cromwells. Fleetwood was finally named Commander-in-Chief, But apart from that, the grandees weren't sure what to do next. They kept up their own meetings, and they'd invited Henry Vane and Arthur Haselrig into them. Where the grandees were treading water, the junior officers were actively pushing for the return of the purged Long Parliament. They wanted the rump back. The pamphleteers had been busy over these unstable weeks, and the campaign for a return to, quote, government as established without a king or House of Lords, end quote, was growing in momentum. The junior officers pushed for the return of Republican officers, like Major General Robert Overton, John Oakey, Edmund Ludlow, men who had once been the darlings of the army. They were clearly darlings still, as they returned to London and to their regiments to the cheers of their men. Pressure continued to mount on the grandees to dissolve the whole structure of the Protectorate. Despite Richard's desperate pleas to his brother in Ireland, George Monk in Scotland, and to the Admiral of the States Navy, Edward Montague, no one came to his rescue. Henry had no way of aiding his brother. Monk was loyal to Richard, but he was also a realist. By the time he learned that events had spiralled out of control, it was too late. He couldn't teleport his army from Edinburgh to London, and even if he could, he knew his men well. They were loyal to him, but there was every chance they would balk at fighting their comrades. He preferred to wait and see. And speaking of the sea, Montague was also a loyal Cromwellian, but he was even further away than Scotland. He was in the Baltic Sea. At the start of May, Fleetwood and Desborough buckled to the pressure from below. Fleetwood, Desborough, Lambert, Vane, Haselrig and Ludlow met at Fleetwood's home. Together, the Commonwealth's men and the army grandees decided the fate of the country. After 2 meetings, the basics of their coalition were settled. The Protectorate was dissolved. The Protector himself would be sent into retirement, but kept on a comfortable pension. The MPs who had been expelled when Cromwell dissolved the Rump Parliament in 1653 were to be invited back, and together they would decide on a new constitution for the Commonwealth. Richard himself took a few weeks to accept his situation. From his letters to Henry, we can see his genuine despair and his anger towards the army, the nation, and himself for seeming to have failed. On the 25th of May, he formally abdicated. Richard had been Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland for 8 months and 22 days. Quote, I love and value the peace of this Commonwealth much above my own concernments. End quote. The restored Rump accepted his resignation, wished him well in his future endeavours, and waited impatiently for him to vacate his official residences. They wanted to put them up for sale. After all, they really needed to pay the army. Everyone connected to the Protectorate project was turfed out of office. In London, John Thurlow and other kinglings were dismissed. Henry Cromwell resigned as Lord Deputy of Ireland, and he was replaced by a commission of 5, 4 of which were radical Baptist Republicans, like Ludlow. They eagerly set about dismantling the moderate civilian government of Ireland and replacing garrison commanders with men more of their persuasion. Nearly half of the officers in Ireland were replaced. On the 14th of May, the seal of the Protectorate was smashed to pieces in the restored Rump Parliament. A new seal, like the one commissioned after the regicide, was ordered. And that was the end of the Protectorate. The clock was turned back to 1649. The Republic was back, and the previous 6 years had merely been a diversion. But if the Republic is back, the Rump Parliament is back, well, so too is a politicised army. The coalition between Commonwealth's men and the army had existed to counter the Protectorate, and they'd won. Next time, we will see the entropy of victory set in as events spiral out of control again. And far to the north of London, the man who had cautiously sat out the latest round of political upheaval was watching and judging, and George Monk did not like what he saw. Thank you to my House of Lords, including the King's favourite, Mike Sanders, the Duchess of Devon, Michelle Gersich, Joshua Brett, Marquess of Devonshire, and Christopher Wood, Earl of Chatham. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. The other best way to support the show is to share it with a friend. Go on, send them a link as you pick something to listen to next. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.